It was the spring of 1938, and the bride at Caxton Hall was 20 years old. Beside her, holding the ring, stood a boy of 16, a prince with no throne and no country of his own. The photographers barely noticed him. But within 10 years, that boy would marry the future Queen of England, and the woman he stood beside would bear 2 children to no named father, and raise the elder under the prince's quiet protection. For half a century, the world would study the face of that child and swear it saw the prince staring back. The people who knew the truth never said it aloud, and the one question that mattered would outlive every soul who could have answered it. If you are drawn to the stories the official record keeps quiet, the secrets that hide in plain sight behind the most famous names in Britain, then subscribe now and stay close. This is one of those stories, and it only deepens from here. Chapter 1. 2 Children of a Fallen Throne. When the Greek monarchy collapsed, it scattered its loyal families across Europe, and 2 of those children would be bound together for the rest of their lives. In the autumn of 1922, a gunboat carried a small Greek family out of a country that no longer wanted them. Among them was an infant prince, not yet 18 months old, asleep in a cot that the sailors had improvised from a wooden fruit crate. His name was Philip, a prince of Greece and Denmark by blood, and a refugee by every practical measure. His uncle, King Constantine, had abdicated. His father, Prince Andrew, had been arrested, tried, and banished on pain of death. The throne the family had served was gone, and the people who had served it were now a loose tribe of exiles, moving from one borrowed house to the next across the cities of Europe. It is a strange fact of history that the most British of consorts began his life as a stateless child with no money of his own. The family that fled Greece did not flee into comfort. They drifted toward Paris, where a web of relatives and well-placed friends could be relied upon to keep them afloat. The roof over much of Philip's early childhood was provided by his formidable aunt, Princess Marie Bonaparte, a great-grandniece of the Emperor Napoleon, who owned a modest villa in the suburb of St. Cloud. She housed the banished branch of the family there for some 7 years, and she paid for the children's schooling besides. Philip's was a boyhood of other people's kindness, lived in other people's rooms, and the lesson of it sank deep. He learned early that warmth, when it came from the families who chose to take you in. One of those families was the Foufounis family. They were Greek royalists too, wealthy, displaced, and devoted to the same lost cause. The father had been a man of means. The mother kept the household together through the long years of exile, and the children grew up inside the same émigré world of summer villas and shared holidays that defined Philip's earliest memories. They were, in the language of the time, people of quality fallen on uncertain times, clinging to the manners and the connections of a world that had stopped existing, raising their children to belong to a court that no longer sat. It was a peculiar way to grow up, suspended between a grand past and an unwritten future, and it bred in those children a particular blend of pride and adaptability that would serve them and unsettle them for the rest of their lives. The Foufounis family kept a holiday house in the south of France, remembered by some biographers as being near Marseille and by others at Le Touquet on the northern coast. Wherever it stood, it became one of the warm places in a cold and uprooted childhood. The exiled Greek royals came and went, and the small prince came with them. There were 3 Foufounis children who mattered to this story. There was a son, Yanni, who became Philip's inseparable companion, the brother in arms of 100 boyhood games, and there was a daughter, older than both of them, named Hélène. She was born in 1917, which made her some 3.5 years older than Philip. old enough to stand a little apart from the boys, old enough to mother them and to tease them, old enough to remember. In later years, she would describe Philip with the unsentimental affection of an older sister. There is a much-quoted memory, passed down through the biographies, in which the young Hélène complained that her own mother paid the little prince altogether too much attention. And yet, in the same breath, she allowed that he was, after all, a very nice little boy. That single sentence holds the whole future of this story inside it. The two of them were not strangers who would one day be linked by gossip. They were children of the same catastrophe, raised in and out of the same rooms, fed at the same tables, bound by the same loss of a country neither of them could properly remember. Philip's own home life, in these years, was coming apart in ways that would mark him forever. His mother, Princess Alice, was descending into a mental illness that would see her placed in a psychiatric clinic for years. His father drifted away to the warmth and the card tables of the Riviera. The four sisters married, one after another, into German nobility and were gone. By the time Philip was 10, he had effectively no settled family of his own, and he was passed into the care of his Mountbatten relatives in England, the family who would shape him into the man Britain would come to know. Set against that loneliness, the steadiness of the Fufuni household meant something. They were not grand. They were not going to make him a king. They simply kept turning up, holiday after holiday, year after year, a fixed point in a childhood that had almost no other fixed points at all. Hélène was part of that fixed point, and a bond formed in that kind of childhood does not dissolve. It follows you into adulthood. It follows you, as this one did, all the way to a wedding and a christening and a school bill, and at the very last, to a silence that no one would ever break. The exiles believed, as exiles do, that the old world might one day be restored. It never was. The thrones stayed empty. But the friendships made in those borrowed villas proved more durable than any crown. Two children of a fallen throne had found each other in the wreckage. The question that would haunt the rest of their lives had not yet been asked. It was only a matter of waiting for them both to grow up. Chapter 2. A Wedding and a Boy of 16. By the time she married, Hélène Fufuni was a beauty of émigré London, and the boy who carried her ring was already something more than a guest. The Fufuni family, like so many of the displaced, eventually washed up in England. London, in the 1930s, was a city that knew how to absorb the titled and the once wealthy from the broken empires of the continent, and the Fufuni family made their place in it. They opened a restaurant in Mayfair and named it, with a father's pride, La Belle Hélène, after the daughter who had grown into a striking young woman. She was dark, poised, fluent in several languages, and entirely at ease in a society that prized exactly those qualities. She had the émigré's gift of seeming both exotic and perfectly at home. Hélène was a young woman in a hurry, as the young often are when their family fortunes have been uncertain for as long as they can remember. And in 1938, at the age of 20, she married. The groom was an Englishman, an American by some accounts and English by others, named William Kirby, known to everyone as Bill. The marriage took place on the 30th of March 1938 at Caxton Hall in Westminster, a registry office that had become fashionable for exactly this kind of society wedding, the kind conducted with style, but without the full machinery of a cathedral. And here the story produces its founding image, the photograph that would be pulled out of the archives and studied for the next 50 years. Standing up as best man, holding the ring, was Prince Philip of Greece. He was 16 years old. He was a cadet, or about to become one, at the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. He was still, in every sense that the world measured, a nobody, a penniless foreign prince with an uncertain future and no country to call his own. But Hélène had asked him to stand beside her on the most important day of her young life, and he had said yes, and the choice tells its own quiet story. You do not ask a passing acquaintance to be your best man. You ask the person who has been, in all the ways that matter, family. Think for a moment about the strangeness of it. A boy of 16, standing as the senior witness at the wedding of a woman of 20. It speaks to how the two of them saw one another across the gap of those 3.5 years. To Hélène, Philip was not a child. He was the boy she had half raised, now grown tall and confident and handsome, the dashing naval cadet who could be trusted with the ring and with the day. To Philip, Hélène was one of the last living threads to a childhood that had otherwise scattered to the winds. They were, by this point, two of the very few people left who remembered the villas, the exile, and the lost Greek summers. Of course, he stood beside her. There was almost no one else who could have understood what the day meant. The marriage itself would not be a success. Bill Kirby was, by the accounts that survive, a decent enough man, but the union had the brittleness of a young marriage made in a nervous decade. Within a few short years, the war would come, and the war would do to the Kirby marriage what it did to so many. He would be posted abroad. The distance would harden into estrangement. And Hélène, still in her 20s, still legally a wife but in practice a woman alone, would find the structure of her life dissolving around her just as the bombs began to fall on London. But all of that lay ahead. On the day itself, there was only the bride and the boy and the ring, and a photographer recording it without the faintest idea of what he was capturing. The image meant nothing in 1938. It was simply a society wedding, one of hundreds. A pretty émigré girl marrying her Englishman with a foreign prince in attendance. No one looking at it could have known that the prince would one day marry the heir to the British throne. No one could have known that the bride would soon become a mother under circumstances the world would never stop discussing. No one could have known that this single black and white photograph would become, decades later, a piece of evidence in a trial that was never held, for a crime that was never proven, concerning a question that no one in the picture would ever answer. A wedding is supposed to be the end of one story and the beginning of another. This one was the quiet beginning of a mystery. The boy of 16 would go on to become the Duke of Edinburgh. The woman of 20 would go on to become the most discussed friend he ever had. And the bond that put them side by side at Caxton Hall, the bond forged in exile and tested by a war that was about to begin, was about to be asked to carry a weight that no friendship is ever quite designed to bear. Chapter 3. The War That Took a Husband. The marriage did not survive the war, and into the gap it left walked a question that would never close. The Second World War fell on Hélène Cordet's generation like a blade, cutting lives cleanly into a before and an after. For young married couples, it was especially merciless. Husbands vanished into uniforms and were posted to the far corners of the conflict, and wives were left to hold together households, nerves, and marriages across distances that letters could not bridge. Bill Kirby went the way of so many men of his age. He was sent abroad, and the marriage, never robust, did not survive the separation. By the early years of the war, Hélène was, in everything but the cold legal paperwork, a single woman. This is the crucial gap in the story, the empty space into which everything else would rush. She was young, she was beautiful, and she was, for all practical purposes, alone in a city under siege. Her husband was gone, and would not be coming back to her in any meaningful sense. But the divorce, the formal severing, lagged far behind the reality, as divorces did in those years. when the law moved slowly and the war made everything slower still. And so, Hélène existed in a kind of limbo. On paper, she was Mrs. Kirby. In life, she was a woman whose marriage had already ended, navigating wartime London with no husband beside her and no clear name for her situation. It is worth pausing on what wartime London actually was, because the backdrop matters. The Blitz had turned the city into a place of blackouts and sirens, of nights spent in shelters and mornings spent counting which streets still stood. It was also, famously, a place where the ordinary rules of life loosened. Death was close and constant, and people lived accordingly. Romances flared and burned out in weeks. The careful conventions of the 1930s, the chaperones and the proprieties, did not survive the bombing. A generation that did not know whether it would see the end of the war was not inclined to wait politely for the divorce courts to catch up with their hearts. Hélène was one of millions living inside that suspension of the normal. Consider the arithmetic of those years, because it gives the human chaos a shape. The war ran for 6 years, from 1939 to 1945. Across that span, millions of British men were posted away from home, many for years at a stretch, and some never to return at all. Marriages made in haste before the call-up dissolved in the long silence of separation, and the divorce rate, which had crept along at a few thousand cases a year before the war, would balloon to more than 10 times that figure in the years immediately after it. Hélène was not an exception to her age. She was a small and vivid example of what the war did to tens of thousands of marriages, the difference being only that her circle of friends happened to include a future king. What set her apart was not the broken marriage, which was commonplace, nor even the children born outside it, which was less common but far from unheard of in those loosened years. What set her apart was who she knew, and the silence she kept. Another woman in her position would have named the father, claimed the maintenance, and worn the small scandal as best she could. Hélène named no one. She raised the children, kept her own counsel, and let the empty space on the certificate stand as the only public answer she would ever give. It was a decision, not an accident, and like all her decisions, it was made with her eyes open. And it was in this gap, in this loosened and dangerous and uncertain time, that Hélène Cordet became a mother. Not once, but twice. In the middle years of the war, she gave birth to a son. A little later, she gave birth to a daughter. She was still, on paper, married to a man who was not present and was plainly not the father, and when the children were registered, the official record was left to speak for itself. The space where a father's name should go was left blank. That blank space is the true beginning of the scandal. In an age obsessed with legitimacy, with the proper ordering of families and the careful tracing of bloodlines, a child registered with no named father was a quiet act of defiance, or of necessity, or of protection, depending on how you chose to read it. It announced that there was a story here that the mother was not prepared to tell. And in the absence of a told story, the world has always been only too happy to invent one. Who was the father, or who were the fathers, of Hélène's wartime children? She would not say. Not then. Not for the rest of her long life. She had her reasons, and they may have been the most ordinary reasons in the world, the reasons of a woman protecting her children and herself from the judgment of a censorious society. Or they may have been something else. The point, the maddening and enduring point, is that she drew a line of silence around the question and never once stepped over it. She gave the world a mystery and refused to give it a solution. Into this silence, a name would eventually be supplied by the gossips, and it was the most extraordinary name imaginable. Because among the small circle of people closest to Hélène in these years, Among the friends who had known her since the lost Greek summers was a young naval officer who was rising fast, a man whose own life was about to change beyond all recognition. He had been the boy of 16 at her wedding. He was now a grown man, a serving officer in the Royal Navy, handsome and charismatic and unmarried. And in a very few years, he would be standing in Westminster Abbey, marrying the woman who would become Queen of England. The war that took Hélène's husband had left a space in her life and a blank on a birth certificate. The world would spend the next half-century trying to fill both, and the man it would reach for, again and again, was the one person who would never, under any circumstances, confirm or deny a single word of it. Chapter 4. 2 children and no name on the page. When the births were registered, the space for the father was left blank, and the whispering began at once. The boy was born in 1943. The world would later receive 2 different dates for his arrival, and the disagreement is worth noting, because in this story, even the simplest facts have a habit of slipping their moorings. He was given the name Max. 2 years later, in 1945, came a daughter, Louise. 2 children, born in the heart of the war, to a mother who was still legally married to an absent man, and registered, both of them, with no father named. Consider what that meant in the Britain of the 1940s. This was a society that had not yet loosened its grip on the old certainties about marriage and birth. Illegitimacy still carried a heavy and lasting stigma, the kind that could follow a child through school, through work, through every form that asked for the names of both parents. For a woman to bear a child outside marriage was to invite a particular and unforgiving judgment. And yet here was Hélène, doing it not once, but twice, and declining, with what looks from this distance like real steel, to offer the world the explanation it demanded. She would carry the secret. The children would carry the name she chose for them, and the world could think what it liked. For a few years, what the world thought stayed mostly private, confined to the circles who knew her. The children needed a settled life, and Hélène set about building one. In 1947, she married again. The man was a Frenchman named Max Boisot, described in the accounts as an officer who had served with the Free French forces during the war, a figure of some dash and substance. With the marriage, the 2 children acquired a surname at last. Max and Louise became Max and Louise Boisot. On paper, the family was now whole. A mother, a stepfather, 2 children, a name they could all share. It is worth understanding just how heavy the stigma of illegitimacy still was in the Britain into which Max and Louise were born, because it explains a great deal about the choices their mother made. A child born outside marriage in the 1940s was marked, in law and in the eyes of society, in ways that are hard to credit now. The word bastard was not a curse in those days, but a legal category, stamped where a father's name should be, a category that closed doors to schools, to clubs, to professions, to the easy acceptance that legitimate birth conferred without a thought. A mother who could not or would not supply a father exposed her children to a lifetime of quiet penalty. Against that backdrop, Hélène's marriage to Max Boisot was not only a romance, it was an act of protection, a roof of respectability raised over 2 children who would otherwise have stood in the rain. And yet even that roof could not cover the years that came before it. The Boisot name settled the children's future. It could do nothing about their past, about the stretch of time when they had been registered to no one, the very years that the gossips would seize on. For the question that was beginning to be whispered did not concern who Hélène had married in 1947. It concerned who had fathered her children years earlier in the dark middle of the war. when her closest friends still included a single naval officer with a remarkable future ahead of him. But a surname acquired at the age of 4 does not silence a question about the years before it. And the question, by now, had a particular shape because of who Hélène's oldest and closest friends happened to be. The marriage to Max Boisot gave the children a father-in-law and in love. It did not, in the eyes of the gossips, settle the matter of blood. For the man whose name had begun to be whispered was not Max Boisot at all. It was the friend from the lost Greek summers, the best man from Caxton Hall, the naval officer who, in that very same year of 1947, was making a marriage of his own that would change the course of his life and the life of the British monarchy. It is important to be precise here, because this is exactly the point where rumour and record must be kept apart. What is documented, beyond any dispute, is that Hélène bore 2 children to no named father during the war years. What is documented is that she married Max Boisot in 1947, and that the children took his name. What is documented is that Max Boisot himself, throughout his life, named Marcel as his father and rejected every other claim. What is not documented, what has never been documented, what no birth record or letter or confession has ever established, is the identity of the man who actually fathered those wartime children. Everything beyond the blank space on the page is inference, and the most explosive inference of all was about to be handed a piece of evidence that the gossips could not ignore. Because at this very moment, as Hélène settled into her second marriage and her children took their new name, the friend from the Greek summers stepped forward and offered to do something for the elder child. He offered to become his godfather. A naval officer engaged to the heir to the throne of Great Britain, a man whose every association was about to come under the most intense scrutiny any family on earth can attract, looked at the fatherless son of his childhood friend and chose to tie himself to the boy in the sight of God and the Church. To some, it was the simplest thing in the world, an act of loyalty by a man honouring a bond older than his fame. To others, it was the first visible thread of a secret. The blank on the page had found, if not a name, then at least a shadow, and the shadow wore a crown in waiting. Chapter 5. The Duke Who Paid the School Fees. A godfather sends a card at Christmas. This one sent a boy to his own old school and paid the bill. On the 20th of November 1947, Prince Philip of Greece, newly created Duke of Edinburgh, married Princess Elizabeth in Westminster Abbey. The penniless refugee child from the fruit crate cot had arrived at the very centre of British life. From that day forward, every friendship he had ever made, every association from his scattered and unconventional past, would be examined under a lamp of a brightness that no private person could imagine. And among those associations was Hélène Cordet and her 2 fatherless children. What Philip did next is the hard, documented core of the whole mystery, and it deserves to be set out plainly, without embroidery. He became godfather to both of Hélène's children, to Max and to Louise. That alone was a striking thing for a man in his position to do, given the questions that already hung over the children's parentage. A more cautious man, a man with a careful eye on appearances, would have kept his distance from exactly this kind of association. Philip did the opposite. He drew closer. And then he did more. He paid for Max's education, not in some small token way, but at the schools that were the most personal possible choice he could have made. He sent the boy to Cheam, the preparatory school he himself had attended. And then he sent him on to Gordonstoun, the austere Scottish school in the north, the school that had shaped Philip's own character through cold showers and long runs and a philosophy of hardship. the school he believed in so completely that he would later send his own sons there, Charles and Andrew and Edward. Of all the schools in Britain, Philip chose for Hélène's son the two that had made him. He took the fatherless boy and ran him through the same forge that had forged the Duke of Edinburgh. Here is the documented record, the spine of everything the rumour would later hang upon. The best man at her wedding in 1938, the godfather to both her children in the 1940s, the payer of school fees at his own two schools through the 1950s. 3 acts, spread across 2 decades, each one a deepening of a bond, each one perfectly innocent on its own, and each one, when laid beside the others, forming a pattern that the public would find impossible to read as mere friendship. A man does not usually fund the schooling of a friend's child at his own old school. A man does that, the whisper went, for his own. But the whisper is not the record, and the record will not be pushed past where it can go. There is another reading of these same facts, and it is at least as strong. Philip was a man who had been raised on the kindness of others. He had spent his childhood in the borrowed houses of relatives and friends, schooled on money that was not his family's, taken in by households that owed him nothing. He knew, better than almost any man of his rank, exactly what it was to be a child, dependent on the generosity of grown-ups who chose to care. And here, in front of him, was the fatherless son of the family that had taken him in during his own hardest years. To pay that debt forward, to give to Hélène's boy the schooling that others had once given to him, was not the act of a guilty father. It could just as easily be the act of a loyal man with a long memory, settling an old account in the only currency he had. Both readings fit the facts. That is the engine of the whole story, and it never stops turning. The kindness is real and beyond dispute. What the kindness means is the one thing no document can establish. And Philip, characteristically, said nothing to settle it, then or ever. To weigh the kindness properly, set the pieces of it side by side. Philip stood as best man at her wedding in 1938, when he was a boy of 16 with nothing to give but his presence. He became godfather to both her children in the 1940s, in the very years his own life was being lifted to the summit of British society. He paid for the boys' schooling at Cheam and then at Gordonstoun across the 1950s, at 2 schools whose fees were the preserve of the wealthy, and he did it while raising his own young family and serving a crown that watched his every move. 3 commitments, spanning more than 20 years, each one freely given, none of them required of him by anything but his own sense of obligation. Few men would have done as much for a friend. Fewer still would have done it under that kind of scrutiny. That last point deserves weight, because it cuts against the simplest version of the scandal. A man with a guilty secret, a man hiding a child, would have every reason to keep his distance, to let the boy disappear quietly into an ordinary life where no one would ever think to look. Philip did the reverse. He pulled the boy close into his own schools, into the documented record, into exactly the places where curious eyes were certain to fall. Either he was a man with nothing to hide, behaving with the open generosity of an old friend, or he was a man of quite breathtaking nerve. The record allows both. It insists on neither. For the boy at the centre of all this, the arrangement had consequences that were not abstract. Max Boisot grew up moving through the same institutions that produced princes. He wore the uniform Philip had worn. He ran the same Scottish hills. He carried, whether he wished to or not, the unmistakable mark of royal favour. And a boy does not pass through Gordonstoun on the personal account of the Duke of Edinburgh without his schoolfellows noticing and talking. The rumour did not begin in the gutter press. It began, as these things often do, in the corridors and dormitories where the children of the powerful compare notes on one another. By the time Max was a young man, the question had been asked so many times, in so many quiet rooms, that it had hardened into a kind of folklore. And folklore, once set, is very hard to break. Chapter 6. A face the cameras loved. While the rumour grew underground, Hélène Cordet became famous above it, on the newest machine in Britain. If Hélène Cordet had been content to live quietly, the rumour might have stayed a private matter, a thing murmured at dinner tables and never printed. But Hélène was not built for quiet, and the post-war years handed her a stage of a kind that had never existed before. Television was coming to Britain, the strange new box in the corner of the room that would, within a decade, remake the entire culture. And Hélène Cordet, with her dark looks, her continental polish, and her complete ease in front of any audience, was exactly the sort of figure the infant medium was hunting for. She was discovered, in the way these things happen, by a producer at the British Broadcasting Corporation, a man named Henry Caldwell, who saw in her the makings of a host. She was given a programme called Café Continental, and it made her, for a time, one of the most recognisable women in Britain. The format was pure escapist glamour, a make-believe evening at a chic continental cabaret beamed into the grey front rooms of a country still bound by rationing and recovering from war. Hélène was the hostess who welcomed the viewer into this imagined world of elegance and music. It ran for years, through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, and it placed her among the genuine pioneers of British broadcasting. She was one of the first women ever to host a programme of her own on British television, a fact that has been almost entirely buried beneath the noise of the scandal that followed her. She tried her hand at film as well, picking up a clutch of roles in the early 1950s, in pictures that have mostly faded from memory. But it was the television work that mattered, because it did something the films could not. It put her face, week after week, into millions of homes. It made her public property. And a woman who is public property cannot keep a private mystery private forever. It is hard now to recapture how strange and powerful early television was, and how few people stood in front of its cameras. When Café Continental began, a television set was a luxury owned by a small and growing minority of British households. But that minority was expanding with astonishing speed, and the people who appeared on the screen acquired a fame of a wholly new kind, intimate and domestic, beamed straight into the front room. There were only a handful of hosts in the entire country, and almost all of them were men. For a woman to front her own programme was close to unheard of. Hélène Cordet was not merely on television. She was one of the first faces a whole nation learned to recognise on it, a genuine pioneer in a medium that was inventing itself week by week. That pioneering status is the part of her story that history has been most careless with. Strip away the rumour, and Hélène Cordet has a real and rare claim on the record as one of the women who built British broadcasting from nothing, who taught a nervous post-war country how to be entertained by the box in the corner. She should be remembered for that. Instead, the very fame that ought to have secured her place as a broadcaster did the opposite. It turned her into a target, because fame, in the calculus of the press, is not a shield. It is a price tag. And the higher her price climbed, the more a certain kind of editor began to wonder what her silence might be worth in print. Here is the cruel mechanism that the rest of the story turns on. The more famous Hélène became, the more valuable her secret grew. A blank space on an obscure birth certificate is of interest to no one. A blank space on the birth certificate of a celebrated television hostess whose children's godfather is the husband of the Queen is worth a great deal indeed to a certain kind of newspaper. Hélène's fame did not protect her. It illuminated her. It turned the quiet dormitory rumour into a story with a market, and the British press of the 1950s was nothing if not a market. There is a real poignancy in the timing. At the very moment Hélène Cordet had built something entirely her own, a career, a public identity, a genuine claim to be remembered for her work rather than her connections. The connection began to swallow the work whole. She had spent her life being defined in relation to a man, first as the older girl who half raised the little prince, now as the mysterious friend of the Duke of Edinburgh. Her success on television should have set her free of that. Instead, it chained her to it more tightly than ever, because it was precisely her fame that made the rumour worth printing. And so the two stories of Hélène Cordet ran side by side through the 1950s, the public one and the buried one. In the public story, she was a glamorous television star, a continental hostess charming the nation. In the buried story, she was the woman with 2 fatherless children and a royal godfather, the keeper of a secret that grew more combustible by the year. For a while, the two stories stayed apart. But they were moving toward each other, and the thing that would finally smash them together was not anything Hélène did. It was a wider storm gathering around the Duke of Edinburgh himself, a storm about his marriage, his friends, and his reputation that was about to break across the front pages of the world. Chapter 7. The Roving Eye and the Thursday Club. The rumour about Hélène's son did not catch fire on its own. It caught fire inside a much larger story the papers were already telling about Philip. To understand why the Cordet question exploded when it did, you have to understand the atmosphere of 1956 and 1957, because the rumour did not detonate in a vacuum. It detonated inside a far bigger drama that the press was already running at full volume, a drama about whether all was well inside the most scrutinised marriage on earth. In the autumn of 1956, the Duke of Edinburgh left on a long tour. He sailed aboard the royal yacht Britannia on a voyage that would keep him away from his wife and his young family for the better part of 5 months, taking in distant corners of the Commonwealth and the opening of the Olympic Games in Melbourne. To a modern eye, it was a tour of duty. To the press of the day, a married man choosing to spend that many months at sea, away from a young wife who happened to be the Queen, was an invitation to speculate. And speculate they did. The papers began to talk of a royal rift. They began to use the phrase that would attach itself to Philip for the rest of his life. They began to talk about his roving eye. The speculation found a focus in a London institution called the Thursday Club. It was a raffish lunchtime and evening gathering of actors, photographers, writers, and well-connected men about town, which met in a private room in Soho and prided itself on wit, drink, and discretion. Philip attended it, in the company of his close friend and private secretary, an Australian named Mike Parker. To the men who belonged, it was harmless fun, the release valve of busy and famous people. To the newspapers, hungry for an explanation of the royal rift they had already decided existed, it became something darker, a den of wild parties, and worse, a place where, the implication ran, the Duke of Edinburgh was being led astray. Then the focus sharpened to a single human casualty. Mike Parker, Philip's friend and secretary, resigned in early 1957. The real reason was painful and private. His own wife had filed for divorce, and a man at the heart of the royal household could not be seen to be the subject of divorce proceedings. But the press read the resignation through the lens of the story they were already telling. Parker was the bad influence, they decided, and his departure was the proof. The truth, that a man was quietly losing his own marriage, was less interesting than the fiction, that he had been cast out for leading the prince into temptation. Parker himself later remembered how the coverage had cut. He recalled that the Duke was incandescent about the reports, very, very angry and deeply hurt. The pressure grew so intense that the palace did something it almost never does. It broke its silence. The Queen authorized her press secretary to issue a flat public denial, stating that it was quite untrue that there was any rift between the Queen and the Duke. For an institution whose entire doctrine is to never explain and never complain, this was extraordinary, a measure of how serious the threat to the marriage's public image had become. To grasp how unusual that was, you have to understand the machinery of royal silence as it operated then and operates still. The first rule of the institution is that it does not respond to rumour, on the theory that to deny a story is to dignify it, to admit that it was worth denying. Most royal scandals are met, therefore, with a wall of nothing, a refusal so consistent that it becomes a kind of fortress. For the palace to step out from behind that wall, to issue a named denial through the Queen's own press secretary, meant that the story of the rift had grown too large and too dangerous to be left to starve. The marriage of the sovereign was the foundation of the whole edifice, and a crack in that foundation, real or imagined, could not be ignored. But the denial, for all its rarity, was a narrow thing, aimed at one target, and one only. It said that there was no rift between the Queen and the Duke. It said nothing whatever about the older question, the one concerning a television hostess and her two fatherless children, and the godfather who paid the school fees. That question the palace left exactly where it had always left it, in the dark, untouched, neither confirmed nor denied. And in the strange logic of scandal, the very act of denying the rift seemed to confirm that Philip was a man surrounded by smoke. If the palace would trouble itself to deny one story about him, the reasoning went, then perhaps the others were worth a second look. The denial meant to close a door. Instead, it threw open several windows. But notice, and this is the hinge of the whole chapter, what the palace denied. It denied a rift. It denied trouble between the Queen and the Duke. It did not address, because it would never address, the older and more dangerous question about Hélène Cordet's children. The denial of the rift only confirmed, in the public mind, that there was smoke around Philip worth denying. And once the press had decided that the Duke of Edinburgh was a man with a roving eye, a man whose private life might not match his public dignity, every old rumour about him was suddenly worth dusting off and printing. The story of the glamorous television hostess and her fatherless children, with the Duke himself standing as godfather and paying the school fees, was the most irresistible of them all. It had everything, and from the late 1950s onward, it would never again be allowed to rest. The buried story and the public storm had finally collided, and there was no putting them back in their separate boxes. Chapter 8. The Book That Answered Nothing. In 1961, Hélène wrote her life down, and the most important fact in it was the one she left out. Faced with a rumour that would not die, a person has a limited set of choices. They can sue and risk dragging the very claim they wish to bury into open court. They can deny and find that the denial only feeds the story. Or they can do what Hélène Cordet did, which was to take control of the narrative by telling her own story on her own terms, and then, at the heart of it, to say nothing at all about the one thing everyone wanted to know. In 1961, she published an autobiography. She called it Born Bewildered, a title with a wry edge, the words of a woman who had spent her whole life being swept along by forces larger than herself, from the Greek collapse to the wartime upheaval, to the glare of unwanted fame. The book was a genuine memoir, a real telling of an extraordinary life. It ran to nearly 200 pages, and it carried more than 30 pages of photographs, the visual record of her journey from émigré childhood to television stardom. In it, she wrote warmly and at length about the childhood friendship with Philip, about the lost Greek summers and the bond between the families. She did not hide the friendship, she celebrated it. And on the question of her children's paternity, the question that was, by 1961, the entire reason a publisher wanted her book at all, she was silent, pointedly, deliberately, immovably silent. She told the story of her life and stepped around its central mystery as though it were a hole in the floor. It was a remarkable performance of control. She gave her readers everything except the one thing they had come for, and she did it without ever seeming to refuse, which is the hardest trick of all. Her private line, repeated to friends over the years, captured the same strategy in miniature. When the subject of the children's fathers was raised, she would say simply that Philip and Marcel had both been wonderful to the children. Read it again, because every word of it is doing work. It acknowledges both men. It praises both men. It places Philip and Marcel side by side in the children's lives, and it settles absolutely nothing. Was Philip wonderful as a godfather and a family friend, or wonderful as something more? The sentence does not say. It was the perfect answer for a woman who had decided that the question itself was the trap, and that the only way to win was to refuse to play. Compare her conduct to the alternatives available, and the discipline of it becomes clear. She could have sold the story. There is no doubt that a frank confession in either direction would have commanded an enormous sum from any newspaper in Fleet Street, the kind of money that could have set her up for life. She never did. She could have used the rumour, hinted and teased and traded on the suggestion of royal blood to lift her own fame. She never did that either, and she could have killed the rumour if she had chosen, with a plain and public denial, the way her son later tried to. She declined even that. She did nothing with the secret except keep it, which was the one course that brought her no profit and no relief, only the steady weight of being talked about for the rest of her days. That is what makes her silence so striking. It was not the silence of a woman with nothing to say. It was the silence of a woman who had decided, with great deliberation, that this one thing belonged to her and to no one else, and that she would surrender it to nobody, not for money, not for fame, not for peace. In an age that increasingly demanded that the famous turn themselves inside out for public consumption, Hélène Cordet kept one room locked, and she kept the only key, and she carried it with her until the day she died. There is a particular kind of power in this, and it is worth naming, because it runs against the easy assumption that Hélène was simply a victim of the rumour mill. She was not only a victim, she was also, in her own way, a master of the situation. The press wanted a yes or a no, because either one would have given them a story they could finish. Hélène gave them neither, year after year, decade after decade. And in doing so, she kept the one thing that was truly hers. Her silence was the last territory she controlled completely, and she defended it to the end of her life. Whatever the truth was, she took it as her own private possession, and no headline, no interviewer, and no amount of public pressure ever prized it loose. But silence is a strategy with a cost, and the cost is rarely paid by the person who chooses it. Hélène could keep her secret and live with the consequences because she had chosen the secret and understood the bargain. Her son had chosen nothing. He had simply been born into the blank space, and he would spend his life being asked to account for a silence that was not his to break. The book that answered nothing protected its author. It left her son exposed. Chapter 9. London's first discotheque. She had been a refugee, a wife, an actress, and a television star. And now, past 40, she invented the modern London nightclub. It would be a mistake to leave Hélène Cordet frozen as a woman defined only by a rumour, because that is precisely the flattening that the scandal performed on her, and she deserves better from the record. The truth is that she was one of the great reinventors of her age, a woman who remade herself completely every decade or so, and her most surprising act came when many women of her generation were settling into quiet middle age. In 1961, the same year her autobiography appeared, Hélène opened a nightclub. It stood just off Park Lane in Mayfair, and it has a fair claim to be the first true discotheque in London, the place where the modern idea of a club, with recorded music rather than a live band, first took proper hold in the capital. She called it the Saddle Room, and she gave it a theme of horses and hunting, all sober tack and show-jumping prints. A wink of old money respectability wrapped around something genuinely new. There was a horse-drawn brougham carriage kept on hand to carry favoured guests home, a piece of theatre that captured exactly the blend of tradition and mischief she was selling. The detail that tells you everything about the place is the music. By the account that survives, the club opened with a starting stock of just 50 records, and onto those few discs it built a phenomenon. The fashionable young of London came to dance to the earliest sounds of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones in a room decorated like a country squire's tack room, and the contrast was the whole point. The Saddle Room became, in the phrase of the time, the place where the better off began to swing. Hélène liked to tell a story, true or polished, that the demand was so fierce the comedian Bob Hope was turned away at the door 3 nights running because the room was simply too full to take him. What she had stumbled onto, or rather what she had seen before almost anyone else in London, was the future of nightlife itself. The idea seems obvious now. A room, a sound system, a stack of records and people dancing to them. But in 1961 it was close to revolutionary in a city where a night out still meant a band, a dance floor, and a set of rules left over from before the war. Hélène took the stiff formality of the old supper club and replaced it with something looser, younger, and cheaper. And in doing so, she helped invent the template that would define the swinging London of the decade to come. The Saddle Room was a small room, but a great deal of what came after, the discotheques and the clubs that made London famous in the 1960s, can trace a line back to it. The arc of it is almost too neat to be true. The woman who opened the modern London nightclub had begun her life as a refugee from a collapsed monarchy, had stood beside a future king as a bride, had borne her secrets through a war, and had pioneered a national broadcasting medium, all before she reinvented the very idea of a night out. She sold her stake toward the end of the 1960s, and a plan to spread the Saddle Room into a chain across Europe came to nothing. But the original outlasted her by years, surviving well into the 1980s before it finally closed its doors. Hélène Cordet had built another thing from almost nothing, in the full glare of the rumour that trailed her, and made it work. Think about the span of this woman's life for a moment, because it is genuinely astonishing. She was born in 1917 into a family of Greek royalist exiles fleeing a collapsing throne. She was a society bride in 1938 with a future king holding her ring. She was a wartime mother and a keeper of secrets in the 1940s. She was a pioneer of British television in the early 1950s. And now, past the age of 40, she was the queen of London nightlife, the woman who taught the capital to dance to records. Refugee, wife, mother, actress, broadcaster, nightclub impresario. Almost no one lives that many lives. She kept tearing up the script and writing a new one, and each new version of Hélène Cordet was as convincing as the last. She sold her interest in the Saddle Room toward the end of the 1960s, and an attempt to spread the idea into a chain across Europe came to nothing. The original club itself outlived her involvement by many years before it finally closed. But the achievement stood. She had not merely survived the long shadow of the rumour. She had built thing after thing in the full light of it, refusing to be reduced to a single question about her past. And yet, for all her genius at reinvention, there was one thing Hélène Cordet could not remake. One piece of the story that would not bend to her will. She could change her name, her career, her city, her entire public identity as often as she pleased. She could not change her son's face. She could not stop people looking at Max Boisot, comparing him to a famous photograph and drawing their own conclusions. The mother could reinvent herself endlessly. The son was stuck with the one thing the press cared about, and it was written on him in a way no reinvention could erase. Chapter 10. The son who looked like a prince. Every few years, the newspapers printed the same two photographs side by side and let the reader do the rest. There is a particular cruelty in the way this story was told, and it lay in the fact that it required no words at all. The newspapers did not need to make an accusation, which might have been libellous. They needed only to print two photographs next to each other and trust the reader to supply the conclusion. On the left, a young Prince Philip, fair-haired and handsome, the dashing naval officer of the 1940s. On the right, Max Boisot as a young man. And the resemblance, the papers implied, would do the rest of the work. What the readers were invited to see was a catalogue of shared features, the same long jaw, the same deep-set eyes beneath a high, clear forehead, the same fair colouring, the same set of the head. Side by side, the two faces seemed, to a public primed to find it, to tell a story that no caption needed to spell out. It was the perfect tabloid device because it was both utterly damning and entirely deniable. No one had said anything. There were just two pictures, and a resemblance, and a question hanging in the air between them. But here the story demands a hard word of caution, and it is the thesis at the centre of this entire film. A face is not a birth certificate. Resemblance is the weakest evidence there is, and the human eye is the least reliable judge of it, because the human eye sees what it has been told to look for. Show a person two faces and tell them the faces are related, and they will find the resemblance every time. The jaw, the eyes, the forehead. These are common features, shared by countless men of Northern European descent who have no connection to one another at all. The side-by-side photograph proved precisely nothing. What it did was far more powerful than proof. It planted a certainty in the mind that no mere fact could later dislodge. And there is a further point, often forgotten in the excitement of the comparison. Max Boisot did have a documented connection to the same European aristocratic world that Philip came from. The émigré circles of displaced continental families were small and intermarried, threaded through with shared ancestry going back generations. In a world that closed, a resemblance between two people need not mean what the gossips wanted it to mean. It might mean only that the old families of Europe had been marrying one another for centuries, and that a certain kind of face recurred among them like a returning tune. The resemblance was real. Its meaning was anyone's guess. There is a reason the side-by-side photograph is the oldest trick in the scandal trade, and it is rooted in how the mind actually works. Psychologists have a name for it, the tendency to see patterns and connections that are not there, the same instinct that finds faces in clouds and meaning in coincidence. Prime a person with the suggestion that two faces are related, and the brain obligingly assembles the case, fastening on every shared feature and quietly ignoring every difference. It is not that the public was foolish. It is that the public was human, and the human eye is a terrible forensic instrument, easily led, eager to confirm what it has already been told to expect. The newspapers understood this perfectly. They did not need to prove anything. They needed only to arrange the two pictures and step back. And so the comparison became a ritual, returning to the newspapers every few years like a comet on a fixed orbit, summoned whenever a slow news week or a fresh royal story created an appetite for intrigue. Each time, a new generation of readers met the paired faces for the first time, and each time the same wordless verdict settled in. Max Boisot did not age out of it. He aged into it. The resemblance to the young Philip, if anything, growing more quotable as he grew into a distinguished-looking man. There was no version of his adult self that the photographs could not be made to serve. He was, in the most literal sense, a marked man, marked by his own face, and there was nothing he could do to wash it off. None of this caution reached the public, of course, because caution does not sell newspapers, and a side-by-side photograph does. And so Max Boisot grew up and grew older under the steady drip of those paired images, reappearing every few years whenever an editor decided the royal family needed a fresh dose of intrigue. He became a recurring character in a story he had never auditioned for, a face deployed at intervals to sell the idea of a royal secret. Whatever he achieved in his own life, and he would achieve a great deal. The photographs were always waiting to be printed again, always ready to reduce him from a man to a resemblance. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that does to a person. To be told, again and again, across an entire lifetime, that your real father is not the man who raised you, but a prince you have no claim on. To have strangers study your face for evidence. To know that the most intimate fact of your own origin is a matter of public entertainment, printed and reprinted for the amusement of people who will never know you. Hélène had chosen her silence and could live inside it. Max had been handed a question at birth and was expected to carry it forever, in his very features, with no way to put it down. The son who looked like a prince paid, every day, for a secret that was never his. Chapter 11. My real father lives in Paris. The one person never asked what he wanted, finally said it plainly, and almost nobody listened. For all the decades that the press spoke about Max Boisot, it rarely troubled to let Max Boisot speak. He was a face in a photograph, a silent piece of evidence, an object of speculation rather than a participant in the conversation about his own life. But Max was not silent by nature. He was an articulate and formidably intelligent man, and when he did address the rumour directly, he did so with a clarity that should have ended it, and would have, in a world that wanted the truth more than it wanted the story. His words on the subject were plain, and they were firm. He said that he had heard the rumours all his life, and that they were ridiculous. He said that his father, his real father, lived in Paris, and that it was silly to suggest otherwise. He traced the whole thing back to its actual root, the childhood friendship between Philip and his mother, and he insisted, correctly, that there was nothing more to it than that. It was not an evasion. It was not a careful non-denial of the kind his mother had perfected. It was a flat, unambiguous rejection of the central claim from the one person with the most right to make it. Marcel Boisot, Max insisted, was his father. The Frenchman who had married his mother in 1947, who had given him a name and a home, who lived out his life in Paris, that was his father, in every sense that Max recognized as real. And there is something quietly moving in the loyalty of it, in a grown man defending the father who raised him against the seductive fantasy that he was secretly the son of a prince. The world was offering Max Boisot a kind of glamour, the suggestion of royal blood, a place in the most famous family on earth. He turned it down, plainly and repeatedly, in favour of the truth as he knew it, and the man he called Dad. That refusal is more remarkable than it first appears, because the temptation ran the other way. Most people, offered the chance to be secretly royal, would find the idea hard to resist. It flatters every vanity at once. It promises significance, mystery, a hidden grandeur that sets a person apart from the ordinary run of humanity. Max Boisot could have leaned into it, could have worn the ambiguity like a fine coat, could have let the world believe what it wanted to believe, and enjoyed the glow of the suggestion. He did the opposite. He pushed the crown away with both hands and held on to the unglamorous truth that he was the son of a Frenchman in Paris, because it was true, and because the alternative was a betrayal of the man who had actually raised him. In that choice, you can see the whole character of the man, and it is the character of someone who valued the truth more than the legend. He had spent, by then, a lifetime watching the world prefer a thrilling fiction to a plain fact about his own body and blood. He had learned that no denial he could offer would ever fully land, that the photographs would always be printed again, that the silence of the two people who could have backed him would always leave him exposed. And still he kept saying it, plainly, to anyone who asked. "My father lives in Paris. It is silly to suggest otherwise." He could not make the world believe him. He could only refuse, to the end, to lie about who he was. But a denial, however firm, runs into the same wall that every other element of this story runs into. Max could say what he believed. He could not prove it, any more than the gossips could prove the opposite, because the only documents that might have settled the matter were the very ones that had been left blank in the first place. And there was a further, maddening asymmetry. Max could deny it until he was hoarse, but the two people whose word would actually have carried weight, his mother and the Duke himself, never spoke to the point at all. Hélène kept her elegant silence. Philip kept his absolute one. And so Max's denial, sincere and forceful as it was, hung in the air unsupported by the only two voices that could have confirmed it, drowned out by a resemblance and a story that the public preferred. Picture the situation in its full unfairness. A man states clearly who his father is. The world half listens, smiles, and prints the photographs again. The two people who could back him up with a single sentence each decline, for their own reasons, to say that sentence. He is left to carry the rumour alone, armed only with his own word, which the world has decided to find less interesting than its suspicions. There is no court he can appeal to. There is no test that anyone will accept. There is only his insistence, set against a silence that everyone reads as guilt, and a photograph that everyone reads as proof. This is the point of no return for the human heart of the story. Whatever the biological truth, and it may have been the most ordinary truth in the world, the structure of the thing was cruel. The powerful kept their silence and paid nothing for it. The famous mother kept her secret and called it her own, and the ordinary man in the middle, who had done nothing but be born, was left to answer for all of them, in public, for the rest of his life. He said his piece. Almost nobody listened, and the Duke, as always, said nothing at all. Chapter 12. The Mind They Never Saw. Behind the tabloid face was one of the more original thinkers of his generation, and almost nobody noticed. Here is the great irony of Max Boisot's life, the fact that the photographs never carried. While the world was busy reducing him to a resemblance, a silent exhibit in a royal mystery, Max was quietly becoming one of the most interesting minds in his field. The man the tabloids treated as a face turned out to have a remarkable head, and the life he actually built had nothing to do with the prince he was supposed to resemble, and everything to do with his own formidable intelligence. He became a scholar, and not a minor one. Max Boisot rose to be a professor of strategic management, a thinker who moved easily between the worlds of business, economics, and the deep theory of how knowledge itself works. He held positions of real standing. He was associated with exile, the distinguished business school in Barcelona. He spent years in China, running a pioneering management program in Beijing in the 1980s, when the country was just beginning to open to the world, a posting that put him at the frontier of one of the great economic transformations of the century. He taught in London, at Birkbeck, the college built for serious students. He was, in short, a genuine intellectual, respected by colleagues across continents. His real subject was knowledge. He spent his career thinking about how information moves through organizations and societies, how it is created and hoarded and shared, how an idea becomes valuable, and how that value can slip away. His major work on the subject, published toward the end of the 1990s, set out a framework for understanding what he called the information economy, and it is still read and cited by scholars today. There is a strange and almost poetic symmetry in it. The man whose own origins were the great withheld secret of his age spent his working life studying the way secrets and knowledge flow, the way some information is locked away and some is set free. He understood, perhaps better than most, the power of a fact that is kept hidden. He had been living inside one his whole life. It is tempting, and probably right, to see the shape of his childhood in the shape of his thought. A boy who grows up as the keeper of an unanswerable question about himself, who learns young that some facts are guarded and never released, who watches the most important truth of his own life sit locked away behind the silence of the adults around him, might very naturally grow into a man fascinated by exactly that, by how knowledge is held and withheld, by who controls it and who is kept from it. His scholarship was abstract and rigorous, the work of a serious mind addressing serious problems of economics and organization. But underneath it, perhaps, ran the oldest question of his own life, the question of what it means to live next to a fact that no one will confirm and no one will deny. His career carried him across the world. Barcelona, Beijing, London, the great centers of learning and commerce, each of them a stage for a man whose ideas traveled as easily as he did. He was respected by colleagues on 3 continents, invited and cited and built upon, the very picture of a successful international academic. And not one of those achievements, not the books, not the professorships, not the years at the frontier of a changing China, ever displaced the single sentence that the public attached to his name. To them, he remained the prince's rumoured son. The scholar lived a large and consequential life. The tabloid figure, the silent face in the paired photographs, was the only version of him most people ever knew, and almost none of this reached the public that knew his name. To the readers of the newspapers that printed his face, Max Boisot was not a professor of anything. He was the prince's rumoured son, a character in a royal story defined entirely by a question about his father. The serious achievements, the scholarship, the international career, the genuine contribution to human understanding, all of it sat in the shadow of a resemblance. A man can win the respect of his peers across the world, and still, in the public eye, be nothing but an unanswered question about his parentage. That was the price of the silence, paid in the currency of a whole life's work going unseen. Max Boisot died in September of the year 2011. He was 67 years old. The end came quickly, only weeks after he was diagnosed with cancer, a sudden close to a life that had so much more thinking left in it. And he died as he had lived, holding to his own account of himself, his real father in Paris, his own name his own, the rumour rejected to the last. Whatever the truth of his origins, he carried it out of the world exactly as his mother had carried it, intact and unspoken. The photographs would outlive him. The man behind them, the actual man with the actual mind, slipped away largely unseen by the people who thought they knew his story. Chapter 13. The silence kept to the grave. One by one, the people who could have ended it died, and each took the same nothing with them. There is a way these long mysteries are supposed to end. A deathbed confession. A sealed letter opened at last. A document discovered in an attic. A diary. A final unguarded word to a trusted friend. The public half expects that the truth, suppressed in life, will leak out in death, that the grave will loosen the tongue that discretion held. In this story, it never happened. The remarkable thing about the silence around Hélène Cordet's children is that every single person who could have broken it chose instead to carry it into the ground. Hélène went first. She died in 1996 at the age of 78. The accounts disagree, as they so often do in her story, on the exact place and day of her death. A final, fittingly uncertain footnote to a life that resisted being pinned down. She had spent more than half a century being asked, in one form or another, the same question. She had never answered it, and she did not answer it at the end. She took her secret, whatever it was, into the grave with her, the last and most complete exercise of the control she had practiced all her life. The blank space on the birth certificate stayed blank. The woman who had filled it with silence was gone, and the silence remained. There would have been, in those final years, 100 easy occasions to let the truth slip. A memoir revised, a confession to a daughter or a trusted friend, an interview given in old age, when the stakes had softened and the principles were fading, the kind of late unburdening that so many guarded people permit themselves at the close. Hélène permitted herself none of it. She had decided, long before, that the question was hers to keep, and she kept it with the same iron consistency at 78 that she had shown at 30. Whatever she knew, she judged that the world had no right to it, and she enforced that judgment to her last breath. Max followed his mother into the same silence, in his own fashion. He had not kept a secret, exactly, for he had always said plainly what he believed. But he had held to his version with the same unbending steadiness, never wavering, never trading it for comfort or for cash, carrying his account of himself out of the world precisely as he had carried it through life. Mother and son, the keeper and the denier, ended in the same place, each having refused, across an entire lifetime, to give the public the resolution it craved. Between them, they had absorbed 70 years of pressure and let none of it crack them. Then came the long wait for the only other person whose word would have settled everything. Prince Philip lived on and on into great old age, the longest-serving royal consort in British history, a fixture of national life for so many decades that it became hard to imagine the monarchy without him. Through all of it, across more than half a century of the rumour, he never once addressed it. Not a confirmation, not a denial, not a hint, a wink, or a stray remark. The man who had been the boy of 16 at Caxton Hall maintained, on this one subject, a silence so total and so unbroken that it became a kind of monument in itself. Philip died in April of the year 2021, just short of his 100th birthday. And with his death, the door that had stood ajar for 70 years swung quietly shut, not closed but sealed, the question locked permanently on the far side of it. The three people at the centre of the mystery, Hélène, Max, and Philip, were now all gone. The mother who kept the secret, the son who denied the rumour, the prince who said nothing. Each had taken the same nothing with them. There was no longer anyone alive who could speak to it with authority, and so the question passed, at last, out of the realm of things that might one day be answered and into the realm of things that never will. This is the true shape of the scandal, and it is worth seeing clearly. It was never resolved because it was never meant to be. The silence was not an accident, not a matter of the right person never being asked. It was a choice, made independently by everyone with the power to end it, and held to with a consistency that is almost unnerving. Hélène chose it. Max, in his own way, chose his version of it, and Philip chose it most completely of all. 3 people, 1 silence, kept faithfully to 3 separate graves. Whatever bound them, it was strong enough to outlast fame, pressure, decades of speculation, and finally, death itself. The question outlived every person who could have answered it, exactly as it was always going to. Chapter 14. The difference between love and blood. In the end, the record holds 2 things at once and refuses to choose between them. So what is left when all of them are gone and the question can never be settled? What remains is the record, and the record holds 2 things at the same time and will not choose between them. The first thing is documented, certain, beyond any dispute. The second thing is unproven, unprovable, and almost certainly now unknowable. And the whole meaning of the story lies in the gap between them. What is documented is the love. Not love in the narrow sense the gossips wanted, but love in the broad and sturdy sense that the facts actually support. A boy of 16 who stood up at a young woman's wedding because she had been family to him in exile. A man who became godfather to her fatherless children when caution would have counseled distance. A prince who took her son and paid to send him through his own old schools, who tied himself to the boy across decades, who never once, in all the years of pressure, threw the family overboard to protect his own reputation. That is the documented record, and it is a record of loyalty, of a debt remembered and repaid, of a childhood bond that held firm through everything the adult world threw at it. Whatever else is true, that much is real. What is not documented is the blood. The claim that Philip was Max's biological father has never been proven, was firmly denied by Max himself, and rests entirely on 3 things that prove nothing on their own. The timing of 2 wartime births, a resemblance in a face, and a silence that the public chose to read as guilt. None of these is evidence in any sense a court would accept, and against them stands the plain alternative, that a loyal man was kind to the child of the family that had once been kind to him, and that a face is only ever a face. A face is not a birth certificate. It never was. It is worth asking why the public wanted the second thing so badly, why a nation chose the thrilling fiction over the sturdy fact, year after year, for the better part of a century. The answer says more about the audience than about the people in the photographs. A Secret Royal Child is a story that flatters everyone who tells it. It suggests that the polished surface of the monarchy hides something human and scandalous underneath, that the great are not so different from the rest of us, that even a prince has his appetites and his consequences. The rumour was never really about Hélène Cordet or her son at all. It was about what the public wanted to believe concerning the man who married the Queen, and the family that has always seemed to live just out of reach behind its palace walls. Max Boisot's face was simply the screen onto which a nation projected its suspicions. The deeper truth this story reveals has little to do with whose blood ran in Max Boisot's veins, and everything to do with the machinery of silence and who it crushes. When the powerful decline to speak, the silence does not protect a reputation so much as preserve a mystery, and it keeps the door ajar forever. Philip's stature was never touched by any of it. He died revered, 100 years almost behind him. The rumour no more than a colourful footnote to a monumental life. Hélène, too, found a way to live inside the question and even to master it. The one who could not escape it, the one who paid the real and daily price, was the ordinary man in the middle. Max Boisot did nothing but get born, and for that he was sentenced to a lifetime as a public riddle, his real achievements buried beneath a resemblance, his own clear word forever drowned out by a silence that was not his to break. That is the cost of a secret the great choose to keep. It is never paid by the great. It is paid by whoever happens to be standing next to them. And so the story returns to where it began, to two children of a fallen throne, thrown together in the borrowed houses of exile, bound by a loss they were too young to understand. Everything that followed, the wedding and the christening and the school fees and the photographs and the 70 years of silence, grew from that single root, from the simple fact that a lonely refugee prince had once been taken in by a family who asked nothing of him and never forgot it. Perhaps that is the whole of it. Perhaps the bond the world spent half a century trying to turn into a scandal was only ever what it always looked like, the lifelong loyalty of a man to the people who had been kind to him when he had nothing. Or perhaps it was something more, sealed behind a silence that three people carried, faithfully, all the way to the grave. The record holds both and refuses to choose. Some questions are not meant to be answered. They are only meant to be kept. If this story held you, take a moment to subscribe, because the history books are written about the people at the center of power, and I would rather tell you about the ones who stood just off to the side and paid the price. And tell me below, in the comments, what you believe. Was Philip's silence the loyalty of a man to a childhood friend, or was it the guarding of a secret? And while you are there,